Rather than rushing toward closure, the stories let yearning expand across long silences. Shots are held long enough for us to notice small gestures, a hand tightening, a subtle shift in expression is the cinematic equivalent of a whispered diary entry. The pleasure for the viewer is precisely this gap. Catharsis arises when the tension between those two kinds of knowing momentarily collapses.
緊張した?
Architecture in Japanese BL sets the stage and it's always expressive. Spaces that might seem generic, like classrooms, rooftops, laundromats, ordinary spaces, rooting romance in the familiar, are transformed into stages where desire is dramatized. They remind us that intimacy is never abstract but always spatial, always dependent on where and how bodies share a room. The architecture supports shaping emotional openness. For example, rooftops in Japanese BLs often embody what Gaston Bachelard in The Poetics of Space calls vertical imagination. They represent escape upwards from noise, from social rules, literalizing the emotional elevation. Spaces elevated above the everyday where characters speak honestly. Together, they form romantic bubbles detached from harsher social realities. The ordinariness of these places is continuously transformed to redefine what space means. A school corridor during the day may be a site of casual interaction, but in twilight it becomes charged with possibility. If architecture sets the stage, the camera dictates how intimacy is felt. Japanese BL dramas often derive their emotional power not from what is said or even what is done, but from how characters exist in relation to space. Distance, whether physical, emotional, or metaphorical, becomes a structuring principle.
ずっとこの距離がもどかしかった。
Characters are often placed on opposite ends of a frame, their separation made palpable by the lens. One sits at a desk while the other lingers by the window, one walks ahead while the other trails behind. The refusal to cross a line in an apartment, the pause before a touch, these are not incidental details, but narrative events in themselves. Even when the characters are together, the camera often frames them with physical objects, desks, railings, doors, cutting the space between them. Few series embody this more literally than I Cannot Reach You. The very title crystallizes the drama's conceit. Distance as both physical and psychological barrier. The viewer is made to feel that the central drama is not simply will they confess, but will they cross this distance. The phrase I cannot reach you is enacted again and again, not only in dialogue but in staging, making the absence of closeness as palpable as presence.
タケルの心に近づきたいよ。
In Takara-kun to Amagi-kun, the theme of distance surfaces explicitly in episode 2, where Amagi reflects,
だからと俺の縮まらない距離ってやつ。
In My Beautiful Man, the staging is even more extreme. Hira is frequently positioned at a distance, watching Kyoi from afar, turning him into a distant idol rather than a reachable lover. Yet, the camera aligns with Hira's gaze, making viewers complicit in his obsession. Watching him observe Kyoi is as intense as watching the characters interact. The series turns Hira's desire into cinematic perspective. This is the architecture of intimacy in extremis. The viewer inhabits Hira's longing before Kyoi even registers it. His worship is spatialized. He positions himself lower, further away, perpetually in the shadow. For Hira, to close the distance would be to collapse the structure of idol and devotee. His love is expressed through maintaining that distance, not erasing it. When Kyoi eventually confronts this imbalance, the breaking of spatial distance signifies a reconfiguration of the relationship. Standing side by side becomes as important as kissing because it symbolizes equality rather than hierarchy. My Beautiful Man builds proximity shot by shot until the audience longs for closeness as desperately as the characters themselves. Eternal Yesterday employs distance in a more metaphysical register. After Koichi's death, Mitsuru continues to behave as if his lover remains present. Here, distance becomes grief, the permanent inability to bridge the space between the living and the dead. The absence of closeness is unbearable, yet the drama teaches the viewer to sit in it, to feel the weight of a space that will never be crossed again.
俺はまだ
光一を探してしまう。
In My Personal Weatherman, the domestic setting dramatizes distance through ritual. Mitsuki's controlling personas contrast with Yo's hesitations, and the apartment becomes a stage where boundaries are negotiated, sometimes respected, sometimes violated, but always charged with the tension of closeness withheld or forced. Because Japanese BL work with the concept of distance so carefully, typical romantic tropes resonate differently, more authentically. Running, for example, in Western dramas often functions as a shorthand for passion or urgency, but it often reads as more superficial, as typically tropes do. Yet in Japanese BL dramas, the act of running holds a distinctly different impact. It is not merely spectacle or grand emotional display, but a profound negotiation of that distance, both physical and emotional. A character has lived in silence or has hidden their feelings, and suddenly the thought of continued restraint becomes unbearable. The run is not impulsive, but necessary. In I Cannot Reach You, Yamato's hesitation defines most of the narrative, his feelings for Kakeru trapped in an unspoken distance. When he finally runs after Kakeru, it is an existential decision. The physical urgency embodies his refusal to let silence dictate the outcome. Similarly, in Eternal Yesterday, Mitsuru's grief-stricken sprint toward Koichi after realizing that memory cannot be postponed conveys not just longing but desperation to cling to a love already slipping away. Perhaps most crucially, running in Japanese BLs signals a point of no return.
どうしてほしい？俺に聞くなよ。そうだね。
Once a character runs, they cannot step back into silence or distance. The act itself transforms the relationship. It is about refusing to let hesitation win. In a way, often hesitation becomes the antagonist, especially since Japanese BL rarely rely on villains to construct conflict. In most storytelling traditions, conflict is the beating heart of drama. Aristotle's Poetics identified conflict as the engine of plot, and countless screenwriting handbooks reiterate the idea: no conflict, no story. In mainstream romance and drama, this typically manifests through externalized antagonism: a rival suitor, a disapproving family member, a workplace superior, or a jealous friend who threatens to separate the couple. Yet Japanese BL often presents stories without clear villains, refusing the easy device of an external antagonist. Instead, the narrative tension emerges from the characters themselves, their misunderstandings, hesitations, vulnerabilities, and interior contradictions.
婚約者とか言ってるのも住むとこ見つけるための口実なだけで。俺と本気でどうこうなりたいわけじゃなくて。
The absence of villains gives these BLs their distinctive softness, while paradoxically intensifying emotional stakes. Because as we will see in more detail later, many Japanese BLs build entire narratives around the gap between interiority and expression. By removing villains, the story emphasizes that the greatest obstacle to intimacy is often the inability to align what one feels with what one says. The lack of antagonists creates an unusual tonal quality. Japanese BLs often feel gentle, even when they are melancholic. Jacko Frost centers on a couple navigating the possibility of rediscovering love. There is no scheming rival. The tension comes from whether memory and affection can cohere again. And this remains true even for dramas which do feature some opposing characters or that are significantly darker in tone, such as Happy of the End or Journey to Kill You.
千尋痛いよ
Film theorists often distinguish between external conflict, character versus characters, society or nature, and internal conflict, characters versus self. In Hollywood structures, external antagonists dominate because they provide clarity and forward momentum. Japanese BLs invert this hierarchy, prioritizing internal conflict as the primary dramatic driver. This is media that thrives on restraint, on stillness, on anticipation. To watch Japanese BL is to be invited into a slower rhythm of perception. After the confession in I Just Want to See You, Sakura and Yuma develop their intimacy through everyday moments.
ユーマとアイス食ってじゃあ帰る
さくらとアイス食って
じゃあまた
帰る
夜が来て
朝が来る
またユーマに会う
またさくらに会う
These everyday, mundane interactions are treated as meaningful, not filler. They are the scaffolding for their emotional connection. The magic lies in normal life, not in dramatic turns. Unlike many other BLs from other countries, which often foreground spectacle, fan service, or melodrama, Japanese BL builds itself from understatement. Its power lies in what it withholds. That's why it maximizes yearning instead of emotional excess, and it dramatizes the smallest physical contact. The magic lies in restraint, the gap between touch and intimacy, desire and fulfillment. In Tokyo in April Yearning is bound up with memory and regret. Kazuma and Ren once shared intimacy, only to be torn apart by betrayal and misunderstanding. When they meet again as adults, their interactions are saturated with unspoken longing, not only for each other, but for the lost time that can never be recovered. Here, yearning is melancholic, a hunger not just for closeness, but for the innocence of youth before things broke apart. This yearning is not forward-moving, but backward-facing, haunted by what cannot be undone. What distinguishes yearning in Japanese BL from other romantic traditions is its aesthetic emphasis. Rather than rushing toward closure, these stories let yearning expand across long silences, slow pacing, and metaphorical imagery. This reflects a broader Japanese sensibility, an embrace of impermanence and subtlety, an awareness that beauty lies not only in fulfillment, but in incompletion as well. Yearning is not a problem to be solved, but a state to be inhabited. And so, while many romances across cultures rely on dialogue to clarify emotions, Japanese BL often privileges what remains unsaid. Silence becomes its own kind of dialogue, one that conveys more than speech ever could. In fact, one of the most distinctive techniques in Japanese BL dramas is the sustained use of internal monologue, which externally reads as silence. In Japanese culture, where verbal restraint and indirect communication are often valued, the inner monologue becomes a crucial cinematic tool. It allows the viewer access to feelings that would never be confessed aloud.
最後のページが来るのが嫌だってもっと一緒にいたいって何考えてんだ俺
The technique also complicates desire. A gesture may seem ambiguous, but the voiceover reveals longing. A confession may appear hesitant, but the voiceover discloses conviction. Silence in dialogue becomes resonance in narration. This oscillation between the said and the unsaid is quintessential to Japanese BL's aesthetic of restraint. While voiceover or internal narration appears across Asian media, its purpose varies. In Thai or Korean BLs, inner voice often functions primarily as narrative scaffolding, guiding viewers through exposition. This is my neighbor, he's annoying, or I didn't realize then how important it would become, or my name is this and I'm this years old and this is where I work. These monologues orient audiences to the plot rather than invite them into interiority. By contrast, Japanese BL uses internal monologue not as commentary most of the time, but as intimate disclosure. It's the cinematic equivalent of a whispered diary entry, not directed at us, but overheard by us. It does not simply tell us what the characters know, but reveals how they feel, perceive, and experience the world. The result is a profound sense of subjectivity. We do not only watch characters fall in love, we inhabit their consciousness as it unfolds. A striking example comes in Takara-kun to Amagi-kun. As Takara begins to realize his feelings for Amagi, the internal narration does not simply announce, I like him. Instead, Takara reflects,
高校生活を共に過ごす旧友の喧騒がひどく不快に感じたあの時から
This immediately places us in his inner world, revealing alienation from the collective. Takara is a figure at odds with the noise of his peers, and the voiceover externalizes a sense of isolation that would otherwise remain invisible.
高校生活を共に過ごす旧友の喧騒がひどく不快に感じたあの時から曖昧だった感情に初めて血が通った気がした。
Here the narration dramatizes an awakening of feeling. Takara, normally withdrawn and emotionally inert, experiences physical aliveness for the first time. It is not simply love, it is vitality itself.
俺はただその人懐っこい笑顔がまるで春を運んできたみたいだと思った。
This metaphor binds Takara's private realization to the rhythm of the natural world. Spring obviously signifies renewal, rebirth, and awakening. Amagi is not just an object of desire, but the catalyst for transformation, someone who alters the very season of Takara's existence. We're not told what Takara feels, we're drawn into how he feels it. And this motif is carried out in the series with Amagi's straightforward affection and physical energy, bringing Takara out of his stillness. Literally, as we see Takara being completely still for the entire exchange in this scene, while Amagi jumps, waves his arms around, only to see Takara almost falling, losing his stillness. In fact, Japanese BL frequently gives us men who are stalled, socially withdrawn, professionally stagnant, or emotionally numb. Romance does not merely add pleasure to their lives, it animates them, providing a sense of purpose, vitality, and selfhood they cannot otherwise reach. So love is framed as transformation. In old-fashioned Cupcake, Nozue exemplifies this condition. A man in his late 30s is competent at work but emotionally inert, caught between youthful possibility and adult resignation. Early in the series, he observes two young women and remarks, "It must be nice being girls." This wistful comment reveals not only gendered envy, a sense that men typically are not permitted such sincerity, joy, and playfulness, but also his own alienation. He has become an observer of life rather than a participant. It is only through Togawa's persistence that Nozue begins to awaken. The ritual of eating sweets together is more than a quirky habit. It reintroduces play, spontaneity, and emotional sincerity into his life. Romance here is existential. It reclaims for Nozue life that had dulled into monotony. The message is not that love solves everything, but that love can reignite one's sense of being alive. In My Personal Weatherman, Yo, which ended up in a depressive, comatose state, is literally jolted back to life by Mizuki's kiss. It is represented even visually with the light in his eyes sparkling back again. In Perfect Propose, Hiro is stuck in an endless cycle of daily overworking and sleepless nights until Kai re-enters his life. In My Beautiful Man, Hira has no clear goals or vitality of his own. He lives through the lens of admiration. In this sense, he's stuck in a posture of inertia, unable to stand alongside Kioi as an equal. When Kioi eventually forces him into reciprocity, not simply to watch but to engage, Hira is jolted into movement.
決まった。え？仕事っていうか、おめでとう。
Love in this case is not a soothing presence, but a disruptive one, forcing him to abandon passivity and to claim agency. Again, romance becomes the engine of transformation, reorienting a life that had stalled. In Eternal Yesterday, Mitsuru is devastated by Koichi's death, his life frozen in mourning. Yet even in absence, Koichi continues to animate Mitsuru. Memories, metaphors, and imagined futures sustain him, pushing him to continue existing.
俺たちが大人だったら、やっぱビールで乾杯とかすんのかな。そうだな。
The motive of the barbecue in the final episode, Mitsuru growing in adulthood, toasting with beers as Koichi once imagined, demonstrates how love's transformative power even outlasts death to give life continuity. Some series even employ shifts in the use of internal perspectives. Instead of restricting monologue to the one protagonist that we see the show through, series often allow both characters to speak their inner truths. This creates a dialogic texture. We not only hear hear desire, but hear its echoes, its asymmetries, and its convergences. Amagi voices his insecurity about whether Takara truly reciprocates.
そういえば一度も好きって言われてない。
While Takara's narration reveals how deeply he feels yet struggles to articulate.
吐いても奥の方から湧き出てくる思いが止まらなくて、ただ溢れてきて。
Just when one may be frustrated by Kyoi's perceived coldness to Hira's worship, the show allows us to shift to his perspective, a subtle reversal that humanizes the beautiful man who initially seemed cold and uncaring.
もう一度会いたい。もう二度と会いたくない。真逆の気持ちの真ん中で苛立ちばかりが募っていく。だけど、ステージで何百の瞳に見つめられていても、あの瞳にはかなわない。
We now know there is vulnerability on both sides. The interplay between voices creates dramatic irony. The audience knows more than either character does individually, making silence between them even more poignant. Cue one of the most common tropes of BLs, which is the constant misunderstandings.
勘違いなら、今までのようになかったことにできると思っていた。
How can characters with such a rich awareness of their own interior states have such a poor grasp of relational dynamics? In Cherry Magic 30 Years of Virginity Can Make You a Wizard, Adachi's inner monologues are an extreme case of this. He overanalyzes every minor interaction, questioning his worth, his social awkwardness, and his fear of being a burden.
もし誰かに心の底から好きだって思ってもらえてることが分かったらなんてなアホらしい。
His introspection borders on self-surveillance, yet this very self-awareness blinds him to the obvious signs of Kurosawa's affection, even when literally he can read Kurosawa's thoughts.
ここに来て心が読めるってのも俺の全部妄想で幻聴説が浮上してきたぞ。あの黒沢が俺のことなんて好きになるわけが。
This illustrates the structural irony of Japanese BL interiority. Self-awareness doesn't guarantee understanding. In fact, it becomes a barrier. The character's inward gaze is so intense that it refracts the external world into distortion. The frequent use of inner monologue turns awareness into self-critique. Characters dissect their own desires in real time, narrating their fears of overstepping. This inner voice isn't neutral. It functions like an internalized social gaze, mirroring the pressures of politeness, hierarchy, and self-containment within Japanese society. In Japanese storytelling, hesitation, restraint, and misunderstanding are not narrative inconveniences, but moral textures. They define the ethical beauty of interaction. The idea that to love sincerely is to risk misreading, because emotional clarity would almost seem presumptuous. Similarly, in BL's, confession is delayed not only by fear of rejection, but by ethical modesty, a reluctance to intrude upon another's emotional space. Misunderstanding thus becomes the safe way to sustain emotional equilibrium until a confession feels morally permissible. In this sense, the Japanese BL protagonist's heightened self-awareness but relational blindness is not a sign of immaturity, it's a form of ethical caution.
好きだから触れないでおこうと思った。
Emotional restraint is a way to protect the beloved's subjectivity, respecting their spoken boundaries. To misunderstand is, paradoxically, to love carefully. So, while Western romantic narratives often treat miscommunication as a plot device to be overcome, Japanese BLs treat it as the very medium of intimacy, a prolonged, hesitant dance where love is proven through mutual restraint. What may seem like a trope used for narrative convenience, one character assuming rejection or misreading an act of care as pity, is what actually constitutes narrative rhythm. In My Personal Weatherman, the two characters constantly misinterpret each other's behavior.
いつも通話してる。オタク友達。あ、そう。
興味ないなら聞くなよ。
Both men are aware of their emotional dependence, but blind to the other's vulnerability. The tension sustains the story's rhythm of minor revelations, each misunderstanding functioning like a micro-confession in reverse. And so Japanese BLs often maintain a deliberate disalignment between what the viewer knows and what the character knows. We see, hear, or somehow understand both subjectivities and thus experience a doubled empathy, frustration at their blindness, tenderness for their sincerity. The pleasure for the viewer is precisely this gap, the friction between self-awareness and relational blindness. It generates the yearning that defines the genre's affective texture. Catharsis arises when the tension between those two kinds of knowing momentarily collapses.
緊張
緊張
した。
した？
The misunderstandings that Western viewers might see as narrative stalling are, in fact, the genre's heartbeat. They make visible the fragile space between knowing oneself and daring to know another. The character's heightened self-awareness is beautiful but incomplete. It is only when they stumble out of their inner monologues into the unpredictable air of mutual recognition that the true magic of the genre occurs. To make a comparison, take one of the most popular Western rom-coms, Notting Hill, where the misunderstanding of Will's disbelief in Anna's sincerity drives the plot until a very public declaration resolves everything. Catharsis here comes from speech, from being heard. Instead, the happy ending in Japanese BL is not necessarily or fully the triumph of knowledge,
よくわかんないやつ。
but of two people finally occupying the same space, even if they still don't fully comprehend each other. The state of impermanence is perhaps one of the most distinctive aesthetic sensibility in Japanese cinema, with the notion of mono no aware, a concept often translated as the pathos of things. This concept, rooted in classical Japanese literature, conveys an awareness of the transient beauty of life and the quiet sadness that accompanies impermanence. It manifests in Ozu's static compositions, where a simple shot of an empty corridor or a vase on a tatami mat conveys profound emotional weight. Ozu's infamous pillar shots, brief interludes showing still life scenes between narrative events, function not as digressions but as spaces for contemplation. Japanese BL dramas embrace the country's defining cinema realism. They often employ static or minimally mobile cameras, long takes, and framing that privileges observation over dramatization. Instead, shots are held long enough for us to notice small gestures, a hand tightening, a subtle shift in expression, details that communicate more than what dialogue could. The realism lies in giving these micro moments room to breathe, mimicking how one might notice someone they love in real life. The audience lives alongside the characters in this way. The series invite us into the rhythms of daily existing. Extended sequences linger on characters in their daily environments, sipping coffee, staring out of the window, navigating small frustrations at work. They are not to advance the plot, but to ground the feelings in lived textures. These details let the audience enter not only the character's romance, but their actual world. Unlike much Western television, where screen time is precious and every scene must advance plot or dialogue, Japanese BL lingers in solitude. Characters are shown alone in their apartments, riding trains in silence, or wandering city streets. These moments may appear uneventful, yet they are integral to the emotional atmosphere of the genre. It envelops the viewer in a contemplative rhythm. In A 25 in Akasaka, Yuki fails at acting convincingly, and he feels this is his last chance to achieve his dream. The series doesn't just show us his defeat during that specific scene, it shows us the aftermath. We dwell in it with him, on the way back, at home, in between sets. In Minato's laundromat, Minato is frequently depicted folding laundry in an empty shop, pausing to watch the street outside, or sitting alone in his modest apartment. These scenes, quiet and mundane, allow us to feel the gravity of his solitude before Shin disrupts it. Without explicitly telling us, the series conveys that Minato's life is marked by absence of companionship, absence of emotional vibrancy. When romance does enter it, it feels like an interruption of an established solitude, a change to the atmosphere we've grown accustomed to. Japanese BL inherits pirates the pillow shots tradition, showing us rooms without dialogue, apartments without company, characters simply being alone. These interludes ask us not to consume plot, but to sit with mood, to contemplate absence as part of the story. And so when intimacy does arrive, the lonely apartment becomes shared space, the silent commute becomes an anticipation of companionship, and the solitary ritual becomes a duet. The more you watch Japanese BL, the more you realize the magic isn't only in the stories. It's in the way the stories teach you to see. They ask the viewer to step into the quiet inner world of another person and understand love not as an event, but as a perspective. There is a quiet kind of queer joy in Japanese BL, which isn't loud, is not defiant, but it is deeply sincere. These dramas don't demand that love be proven, only that it be felt.